Good evening, everybody, and welcome to A Real Point of View. I am Greg Morgan, your host, and I'm also the Real Movie Guy. You can probably find me on Twitter and on Facebook, definitely. And I'm joined by the movie maven herself, Miss Karen D, and Steve C, the man who doesn't pick a bad movie. Tonight, we're going to talk about uh, three films that we were looking at. The subject came up about 1968. So why don't you give us a real brief idea as to why you brought up 1968? Because this was Karen's idea.
Oh, okay. Because 1968, amazingly enough, was 50 years ago. And what was, I just think it's interesting to sort of take a look at what movies were like 50 years ago especially versus today. And just sort of, kind of remember or visualize what life was like back in 1968. 1968 was an extremely turbulent year in America. Mm-hmm. There were two assassinations of major political figures, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, less than 3 months apart. There was a presidential election that year, riots because of racial issues throughout the country. It's an extremely turbulent time. The Vietnam War was still going on. There were protests over the Vietnam War as well as over racial injustice. And, and I think what's interesting, I looked at the list of like, say, about 300 or so of the movies that had been released in 1968. And given what was going on in America at the time, I have to say I was relatively surprised that very few movies actually addressed those issues. Mm-hmm. There were, I was just very surprised to see that there were far more comedies in the list of movies that had been released in 1968 than I remembered off the top of my head. And movies that dealt with like the typical mystery or the typical, romantic comedy. Not a lot of particularly, hard-hitting sort of political, provocative political type movies. Mm-hmm. I think you would find more of those in 1967 or in earlier in the 60s, or maybe after Watergate, or certainly beginning with All the President's Men. But 1968, not so much, right, in my opinion.
Makes sense.
Makes sense, totally. Yeah. And I think it's kind of good to always look back. I think where people miss in life is the fact that history plays so much a part in everything that goes on today. And to not give the history its due, in some cases keeps you in the dark about what's actually happening currently or could be happening in the near future. So regardless of whether it's a turbulent situation or as you alluded to, Karen, some of the more comedic things. I mean, there's so many things in life over time, and we don't really realize in many cases how much these things in the past have affected us, our current lives and ideologies. So I like looking back. I think it's great to look back, and then especially since there's so many films out there, at least I know in my case, that I've always, loved that were older films. One of my favorite films is Captain Blood, and that came out who knows how long ago.
Well, it was in the 30s.
Yeah, it was in the mid to late 30s, correct. And with our boy Basil Rathbone, one of the best swordsmen in Hollywood. So there's a lot you can learn from history. There's a lot you can learn from historic films. And there's a lot you can learn from documentaries. But there's a lot you can learn from films that were just there to entertain us and just give us that time away from the drudgeries and hardships of our lives and give us just that time to relax and try to focus in. Now, obviously, back then, movies were a big deal because they were big screen situations. We have the ability now to see things in so many different venues, theaters, your phone, streaming, whatever, DVDs. So with that being said, sometimes you get away from the sociology, I'm not saying that right, the social essence of being around other people watching films and getting people's initial reactions sometimes, especially in mass. But also, too, the experiences of the past are not so out of sorts. Many of the things that have happened in the past are still happening today. And in some cases, that's great because, you want community, you want family, you want kinship, you want friendship, things like that. In my opinion, those are really good things that have continued on in life. But then you have some other things that are not so positive, not so definitely life-changing, but not necessarily in a good way. And for example, the movie that I chose for our talk today, for 1968 films, is The Detective. It's talking about a social issue that is still relevant today, and yet this happened, 50 years ago. And this goes to show you, in the situation probably long before that, but just goes to show you that in many cases, time doesn't stand still, it revolves and it goes in a circle and things come back around. And this is one of those situations that had come back around. Now, things are not as turbulent as they were before with regard to the subject of my film, but it's only something that's been relevant in a very not so distant past. So I don't know what the films that you guys picked and what their relevance would be today, but why don't we at least find out what films that you're going to talk about today? Karen or Steve, either one of you guys can take it from here.
I guess I'll go then. I was just looking to see if she jumped in.
I was going to, but then you did.
Well, you know what? Too slow.
I was.
This was a turbulent time in the United States, and I decided to pick a more lighthearted movie. And I picked The Love Bug, which of course we know is Herbie the Love Bug now, but it really didn't have a name when they started, and then it ended up just getting a name as production was going. And we all know the car. It's got a mind of its own, and it gets all into hijinks and craziness. And I feel like it was a good movie for the time to kind of give everybody a moment to relax from everything that was going on.
Karen. And so what picture did you facilitate, Karen? What movie are you going to talk about?
I want to talk about Bullitt. It's one of the best-known movies that Steve McQueen did. Steve McQueen was the star. Jacqueline Bisset, and the supporting cast consisted of a number of character actors who are well-known in the industry, not so well-known away from the industry. But that's the movie that I wanted to talk about.
Okay. So 3 pretty good, decent movies, 3 relatively popular movies at the time, for the time. And as you alluded to, Karen, very different in scope. So why don't we go ahead and get started? How about you, Steve? Why not? Tell us about The Love Bug.
All right. Herbie, The Love Bug stars Dean Jones, Michelle Lee, and Buddy Hackett, and which is kind of a good comedic cast for the time. And it starts off with Jim, who is played by Dean Jones, who's down on his luck race car driver, and he's actually an older gentleman who's forced to compete with people half of his age in demolition derbies. He's fallen so far off. Well, finally he gets into a wreck at the demolition derby and he loses his last car, and his buddy, who is named Tennessee Schmitz, which is, in my opinion, one of the best names, or Steinmetz, that's it, which is just an amazing name. But played by Buddy Hackett, he takes cars that have been destroyed and turns them into art and gives them life and presence. And instead of being able to rebuild the car that he just wrecked, Jim finds out that Tennessee has taken it upon himself to turn it also into art. So now he's a race car driver who's down on his luck with no car. So it's a dire situation.
Yeah, it sounds dire.
Yeah, it is. But Tennessee has a way of turning things in lightheartedly into euphemisms and I have no idea what the other word I'm looking for is. I apologize. But, you know, kind of twisting things around to make you think somewhat positively. So, Jim ends up going to a dealership that's owned by a British gentleman who is also a race driver, who is David Tomlinson, who's been in a bunch of movies himself. He always seems to play that kind of sly character that's normally villain-ish. But this is where Jim meets Herbie. And you notice immediately that Herbie kind of has a different thing about him, because they're in the showroom and all of a sudden this Volkswagen out of nowhere just rolls into the showroom and bumps him. I was like, oh, look at this car. Where did this car come from? And of course, Thorndike, who only sells exotic, luxury, nice cars, starts to yell and abuse the car, which Jim doesn't want anything to do with. But so they get the car out of the showroom. Jim is turned away because he doesn't have enough money to afford one of Thorndike, who Tomlinson's playing's cars. So he hops on the trolley in San Francisco and heads home. Well, Herbie follows him, if you could believe that. This car just randomly follows him. And then they slowly start to have a back and forth as it's going. Well, it turns out that Herbie is actually a whole lot faster than he would appear to be as a Volkswagen Beetle. Jim decides, hey, why don't we go racing with it? And all of a sudden they start winning races. Jim starts getting his name out there. They start exploding and, getting really popular. And it kind of goes through the back and forth of Jim believing that he's getting back in his racing form. He's getting back to greatness, when it's actually this car that's the only thing that's helping him win. And it's comedic back and forth between the two. Tennessee adding in his comedic sense of, you need to understand that this car is alive. This car has a mind of its own. This car has a heart and a soul. And there's points in the movie where they have the downward turn where Jim decides that he doesn't need Herbie anymore. He needs a real car to go win races, that it's not about Herbie or anything. So Herbie tries to jump off a bridge. Yeah, Herbie, the car, tries to jump off a bridge.
That's kind of odd.
I know, it's kind of odd, but either way, they make up. And, they like all car movies or racing movies, they have that climactic last race where everybody gets together and, the heroes win the day. The guy and the girl finally get together, and the car. And it's just an overall light-hearted comedic movie with the small hijinks of Thorndike's character thrown in. At one point, he gets Herbie drunk.
Motor
How do you get a
oil
car
or-
drunk?
Irish coffee. And I don't. Irish coffee will get anybody drunk.
That's true.
So, but
in my early life, I experienced that.
Yeah. So, but that's the back and forth of this movie. It's really lighthearted. It's very comedic, and it should be experienced as the first of the Herbie style movies.
I do have a question for you, Steve.
Yeah.
If I could intercede. 2 questions. One.
You only get one.
Okay, I'm going to merge this question into one question. For a guy who's down on his luck and doesn't have any money, how do you pay for the car? And if you did pay for the car, how did he steal it and still make money? And people know that he had the car and he was popular, and yet they didn't come after the money and or him.
The car followed him home. He took the car back. Thorndike didn't want it anymore, so said, hey, pay me what you have and then you can make payments on it. Cool, I'm going to race it to make payments. He gets the car. It's in his name. And then he goes and wins races. And that's pretty much it.
Good answer. Appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That summed it up for me.
Yeah, thievery at its finest.
I
guess, wait. Can you really call him a thief if the car ran away?
No.
Well, here's the thing. Did he lure the car away?
He did defend the car's honor in the showroom when Thorndike was hitting and yelling at the car.
See, there you go. That's a lure in itself. It's a very underhanded technique.
So what do you call it when the car tries to kill itself? Is that caricide or autocide or?
I think it's still technically suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I think the act is suicide.
Uh-huh.
Thank you, Karen, for taking this back to the somber note of the 1960s.
My pleasure.
You did this. This is
Cars. Karen, your movie Bullet with Steve McQueen, doesn't that have something to do with cars?
It did.
Yes, it does.
It's also a comedy, much like Love Bug.
It is not a comedy. There's nothing about that movie.
I found much to laugh about watching. I laughed and laughed. No, it's not at all a comedy. There's nothing funny about Bullet. Yeah,
I'm seeing Steve McQueen kind of haunting your dreams if you were going to keep going with that one.
Right, he would not appreciate that. This was one of the reason I picked this movie is because it's one of those iconic movies from 1968. And it's kind of interesting. I think one of the things we were going to talk about was whether these movies stand the test of time. And so before I start with mine, Steve, do you think Love Bug kind of holds up 50 years later? Or does it come off as corny or sort of?
I feel like it holds up because it's a lighthearted comedy that parents can sit down with their kids and still watch and be like, this is what I saw when I was a kid. This is what I got to enjoy. And I feel like kids, especially with as popular as the Cars movies are, and even though they haven't made one in a couple of years, that it still carries such a good weight for adults to children, for adults to go back and watch a movie that they could still find funny. I mean, the jokes are still funny. The comedy is still there. It's got that old Looney Tunes type, not completely destructive, but that Looney Tunes type presence about it that really still stands.
Interesting. Well, my movie Bullet is about sort of tough as nails cop who's played by Steve McQueen, who's given this assignment to protect a witness. There's a politician, and reading different reviews or synopses of the movies, either senator, a councilman, a DA, I'm totally confused as to what post this person has. But this politician who's having hearings that have to do with white-collar crime, wants this witness protected so that he can appear at the hearing. The councilman or the politician is played by Robert Vaughn. So the two big stars in this movie are Steve McQueen and Robert Vaughn. Jacqueline Bisset plays Steve McQueen's, I'm not sure if it's his girlfriend or his wife, but they're living together. So there's that. Robert Duvall has a small role as a cabbie. And when I'm watching this movie came out in 68, and when did Godfather come out? 1969 or 70? And you know, he had very few lines. I mean, he literally was just a cabbie. I'm like, is he a cabbie with conscience? Is he a cabbie who is somehow tied in with the mob? Is he a cabbie who's an undercover cop? No, he was just a cabbie. Literally just that. It was like a day player role. And I'm like, you know, and I'm watching this thinking, you know, in less than 2 years, he's going to have like a role that's going to literally change his life in The Godfather. But anyway, so there's that. And then, like I said, there were other character actors who who were part of this movie. Simon Oakland, I think, definitely deserves a mention as Captain Bennett, and sort of like the captain to Steve McQueen's, you know, cop persona. Norman Fell is another captain, and very well-known character actor. George Stanford Brown plays a doctor in this movie, and he became later on very well known as a director. But he made quite a living as an actor before he became a director. So he's one of those people who made a living on both sides of the camera. Anyway, so Steve McQueen's character, his name is Frank Bullock, gets this assignment from Robert Vaughn. And so they put this guy's in this horrible hotel room, and they're watching him on shifts. It's Steve McQueen and then a couple of his other colleagues are watching him on shifts. Steve McQueen is off at home asleep when he gets the phone call. Someone's busted into the room and killed the cop who was watching the witness, or not killed, but shot the cop who was watching the witness and shot the witness. So that's when the movie gets started. And Robert Vaughn, as the politician, is not at all shy about throwing his weight around. And he says to the nurse, well, you know, after talking to the doctor and playing very nice, he says to the nurse, well, you know, I want a different doctor assigned. And I'm like, where does he get off giving these orders? It's not like he's like a relative. Well, you know, the nurse is like, okay. And you know, he'll say to Steve McQueen, you know, I'm going to have your badge. I'm going to talk to your captain, you know, and he also just has this very passive aggressive way of sort of like addressing people. He'll play very nice to their face, and then he'll go behind their back and say, well, you know, I want this done or I want that done. If he's not getting his way. So you never know. And when you're watching the movie, I think I saw the movie when it first came out. I know I'm dating myself, but so what? And
you
then
date other people?
With other people.
It was a bad joke. Sorry.
Oh, I think I saw the movie when it came out, but even if I didn't, I'm sitting here watching this movie now going, okay, is Robert Vaughn's character, is he like corrupt? Is he like in with the mob, or is he not in with the mob? Is he really just trying to get this hearing, you know, off the ground, or what is going on? And I really couldn't tell. So anyway, the main thing that I came away with from this movie was that the actual movie itself, the plot of the movie, very thin. I mean, it's really a simple story. You know, a cop gets an assignment to watch a witness. The assignment gets blown, and then after that, Steve McQueen is after the guys who shot up his cop buddy and shot up the witness. That's the story. That's it. There's nothing else. There are no layers. There's no subtext, no deep-seated, you know, conspiracy theory, nothing. That's the story. And on top of that, there is the just regrettably cheesy addition of Jacqueline Bisset as Steve McQueen's girlfriend / wife, who literally, I mean, and I'm as a woman, I'm all for women being in movies, but in 1968, they weren't doing us any favors. So she literally had nothing to do except to appear in like a big shirt without pants, and to look provocative. That was one scene. I'm like, okay. And then another scene, I guess she's like some sort of artist, or she's working in a design firm or something like that, and she and Steve McQueen sort of don't talk, but then they kind of do talk, and that's another scene. And then like 2/3 of the way through the movie, she says to him, I just don't know who you are. You keep so much stuff inside, and I'm like,
is it the lack of communication?
I'm like, wait a minute, you're saying this now. I mean, everything was fine like 2 scenes ago, but now you want to know why he's not communicating. Seriously, dude? If this is all you have, you can go. So that was her contribution to the movie, and as I said, totally regrettable. Here's the thing that makes this movie stand the test of time, and it's really only three things. 3 things make this movie stand the test of time. One is the car chase. There's only one car chase. And when I say the car chase, those of you out there who are film buffs know what I'm talking about. It's the car chase. It happens exactly an hour into the movie. And it's in the city of San Francisco. There's a Dodge Charger, and I can't remember the other car off the top of my head. But they are running, they're chasing each other through the streets of San Francisco, through the Mission Hill district, up and down all of these hills. I think the script called for them to do like maybe 75 to 85 miles an hour. They were doing 110 miles an hour. Steve McQueen did a lot of his driving, did a lot of the driving in these chase scenes because he was an actual real live race car driver and a motorcycle racer, and he wanted to do his own stunts. Now, he didn't do all the driving, but Eakin, who was one of the best race car stuntsmen in the business at that time, did a lot of the driving too. They sort of split. So there's that. Absolutely fabulous. That was thing one. Thing two, the film editing, for which an Academy Award was won. That was the film editing, the way in which especially the race scenes were cut was just stunning. And the music was practically a character. Lalo Schifrin did the music. And I will just say this before peace out. During the race scene, the director, Peter Yates, wanted the race scored, wanted the car chase scene scored. Lalo Schifrin said, no, let's not do that. And so you don't hear any music. There's no dialogue. It's just the sounds of the cars. And they really ring true like dialogue. And I think that's really interesting. And it really set the stage for other sorts of movies that came later, like The French Connection. But anyway, really interesting from that standpoint, but from a script standpoint, snoozers. Except for Steve McQueen, who was just like the persona in spite of the weaknesses in the movie.
Sounds cool. Bullet's one of my favorite. And I'm not a huge car scene guy, but in the realms of that film, it's actually pretty neat. So, and I know there's a lot of, as you alluded to, Karen, a lot of race car chasing aficionados and fans out there who probably think Bullet is one of, I would guess, is probably one of the top movies out there. So, real quickly, let me get into The Detectives. This stars Frank Sinatra, Lee Remick as his wife, and guess what? Jacqueline Bisset.
Where have I heard that before?
Yeah, in this film, this takes place back in the late '60s, and the subject matter of this film is there's a homicide. A man is beaten to death, and come to find out that this man is beaten to death. At least they assume initially it being somewhat of a hate crime. This person was homosexual, so they're fearing that some group, some fast something, someone hated this person. Well, they find out later that it was actually this guy's roommate who was just insane, and they finally coerced the information out of him, and he admits to the crime. But the irony is that Jacqueline Bisset's character comes out, she's a widow, and so she goes to the detective to talk to the detectives because she thinks that what seems to be a homicide was more than just that. And she wants to bring Sinatra, this very calm, cool, and collected detective, to try to look into it. Well, here's the irony. The essence of the film and what makes the film even more interesting is that somehow, some way, the death of the widow's husband has something to do with the death of his first case, the previous case. And now there's some political pressure that's being put on, and he's trying to understand, well, why is that? So now he's involved in something much bigger than himself, much bigger than the cases that he was involved in trying to find out what the connection is between these two cases, where the situations are so very different. So how does that relate to things today? Very recently, hate crimes, because of a person's gender choice, have been in the news in the last decade, very heavily so. But also, too, with that being said, a lot of things have come to pass where things have changed so much so in the acceptance, in the social acceptance of people who have differences in diversity, that that's a positive thing in this day and age that has occurred to make things a little bit more peaceful in our lives. But yet, sadly, just like anything else, we're talking 50 years ago, murder, beatings, crime, conspiracy, still very prevalent 50 years later, not just in film, but in reality. So it's really interesting how the films of the past can still relate to the films of the future and the present. So as this goes on, to answer your question, Karen, does it relate to now? Is it still relevant now? And I say yes. This particular film is definitely relevant now. Well, I wish we had a lot more time to hang out with you today, ladies and gentlemen. Our time is kind of short. Any passing words, any positive essence coming out of either of these films that you want to express before we get out of here?
Well, I mean, we have, I mean, interesting range of films here, you know, and I don't know, it's, I like, for me, I think it's just kind of interesting the way that Steve McQueen embodied cool. He's still considered like one of the coolest actors today. And I think what made him cool was that he wasn't trying to be cool. And these days, there are so many people trying to be cool. So very interesting from that standpoint.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for hanging out with us here on A Real Point of View. Thank you, Steve and Karen, for your insight into film. And we hope that some of these films you'd be really interested to watch, ladies and gentlemen. Check us out on our YouTube channel for other films and situations. And we thank you again for watching, and have a wonderful night. Thanks from here on A Real Point of View. Take care, everybody.